Well, I am excited to have this conversation, and I'm sure you are so excited to talk about taxes. Let's just be honest, it's not something that's natural to want to spend a lot of time on, but we're going to do it. These gentlemen are going to move the podium for me. And just to kind of warm us up, I want to read to you a couple of tax quotes to just kind of get you in the mood to think about taxes, okay? So the first one I want to read is, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fella behind the tree. This is a really common one that we'll put up in front of our students in public finance. This one's a little bit more complicated, but just try this one on for size. The power to tax is the one great power upon which the whole national fabric is based. It is necessary to the existence and prosperity of the nation, as is the air we breathe. It is not only the power to destroy, but also to keep alive. Okay, that was kind of serious. All right, let's try another one. The art of taxation consists of plucking the goose as to obtain the largest amount of feathers with the least amount of possible hissing. Okay. By the way, these are people that think about these things, like how to have less hissing but get the revenue. And then the last one I'll share, and I think this one is really, really important, especially in a conservative state like Utah. The government cannot give to anybody anything that the government does not first take from someone else. It's kind of a sobering thought, right? Okay, we have on our panel here just this magical group of people to think about this. Like, this is really the best people we could put up here. We have Juliette Tennert, who you've already heard from, who's the chief economist for the Gardner Policy Institute. We have Phil Dean, whom you've already heard from, but who is the state budget director and chief economist for Governor Herbert. Will you guys raise your hand when I mention your name, just so we, okay, they know that. Jonathan Ball, right here. Jonathan is the legislative fiscal analyst, which means he's in charge of the budget, the fiscal condition of the state for the legislature. So he's a guy that's usually behind the scenes, and we got him on the stage today. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. We have Peter Reichard, who's the president of the Utah Foundation. So, you know, we've got a think tank represented on the thing. And interesting about Peter, Peter has spent a lot of time thinking about public finance in other states. So he brings some out-of-state perspective. And then we have my good friend Darin Mellott. Darin is the research director for the Americas for CBRE, I believe the largest commercial real estate firm in the world. Let's give them a hand. Great group. So we're going to talk about tax modernization, and I think a hallmark of the first part of today was this idea that Utah has the ability to see around corners. It was in the video, it was in the governor's remarks. A couple of examples. You know, we invested in transit ahead of time, and look at what it's done for us. Look at what we did with the living legacy for the Olympic Winter Games. And then I loved what Phil mentioned today, quadruple A bond rating. That sounds like a fiscal scene around the corners, that we would be worthy of that. And so today, we're doing one of those exercises where we're seeing around a corner, and we're thinking about the structure of Utah's taxes, and can we do something now to see around a corner? I'm going to go to Darin Mellott first, since we haven't heard from him yet, and just ask Darin to kind of summarize, as the Director of Research for the Americas, what you see in 2019 for the economy.
Sure, thank you. So in late 2018, everybody's well aware of the market volatility, and it was generating all sorts of headlines, right? And people beginning to talk about recessions and things of that sort. And so in my latest presentation, we asked the question, is there going to be a recession? And the next slide is, of course not. So what happened in the last part of last year is a couple of things. There were lots of factors in play, but I would focus on two. Worries about trade policy, and then also worries about tightening financial conditions. And so that's why there was so much focus on this latest Fed rate hike. Now, as the Fed has backed off of that, and by their own comments say they only expect 2 more this year, down from 3, the market's pricing in even less, that's soothed the markets a bit. But if you look broad-based, Business sentiment, extremely positive. Consumer sentiment, extremely positive. When we run all these factors through our models, we see a pretty healthy year for consumption. So in spite of the fact that growth will taper off as the effects of fiscal stimulus wane, and then you have these other issues such as the government shutdown, it will have a greater impact if we remain dysfunctional for longer, obviously. But holding all things constant, we think those key factors in terms of business sentiment, consumer sentiment, are going to allow us to continue growing at a healthy rate this year, even if the growth rates do taper off somewhat.
All right, so 2019, think of steady but moderating growth.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But still a year that economists feel good about.
And by the way, Phil mentioned some upside potential. And there is some upside potential.
Okay.
So,
This
for example,
sounds like an economist panel, doesn't it?
Yeah. So,
Meaning, we got the left and right. Okay.
Well, we'll see if the trade disputes
So-
are resolved, and then also there's pretty loose fiscal policy around the world.
Yeah. So the governor said something interesting. Said a lot of things interesting, but I loved when the governor said, and I think you were quoting your father, we got to make hay while the sun shines. So the sun's shining on the Utah economy. Two questions just to kind of set this up. Can we use this prosperous time to fix a structural problem? I want you all to have that in your mind. Can we use a prosperous time to fix a structural problem? And then the second question, if we act now, can we avoid making even more difficult decisions during hard economic times? That's really what we're putting out there. So I'm going to put up a slide here. And you've seen this before, but this is what we would call the money slide. Follow the money. The money slide means this is the most important slide in the deck. And it documents a trend. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you. Can you explain this trend and tell this audience why they should care?
Sure.
You've got 1 minute.
Okay, I'm going to do it with an anecdote. How's that?
Sounds great.
When I was 16 years old, I grew up in Michigan. I wanted the worst thing in the world. I wanted a car, right?
That's what Michigan people
It's what
do.
we want. It's what my dad was building them. I wanted one. And sure enough, saved up my money and was able to buy an old beater and pay my sales tax on the old beater. So my oldest daughter turned 16 a couple of years ago, and I thought, what I'm going to do for her what my dad couldn't do for me. I'm going to give her a car, and it was awesome. 16th birthday came around, so pleased with this. It was an old beater, I will admit. Gave her the car keys, and she was sort of, not overly excited about it. And I thought, okay, she's my daughter. We're not emotive people, so perhaps she's just not. And asked her, why aren't you so excited about it? And she said, well, I want to go to Nepal. That's what I want to do. I don't want to necessarily want a car. I want to go to Nepal. And that's when it hit me that, I paid sales tax on my car when I bought it when I was 16. And I don't know if they collect sales tax in Nepal or not, but I'm pretty sure they're not paying us the sales tax.
Yeah, that's a leakage of our money.
So that's what's happening here. We're changing how we consume, what we consume, and as we do that over time, our tax system isn't changing to adapt to our changing consumption patterns.
Yeah, so sales tax used to be 67% of our economy. That's what this graph is showing. It's fallen to 42. Our forecasts are it's going to keep going to 35. So let's thicken the plot a little bit. I'm going to go to you, Juliette. Why, we have a surplus. We have a strong economy. There's plenty of money up on Capitol Hill. Why do we care? If we have other revenues growing, so why is the sales tax issue catching our attention?
Yeah, sure. So you have to remember that in Utah we have two major revenue sources. We have the income tax, which is constitutionally earmarked for purposes of education, and then we have the sales tax. And so the sales tax funds everything else. So, Medicaid, everything that's going on in health and human services, really all of general government, everything else. And so as we have this system where that sales tax just isn't growing with the general economy and the demands of the general economy are growing, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to keep pace and to actually fund everything else, general government.
Yeah, okay, so I read those quotes about how taxation is really important to the natural man, it's important, you know, as the air we breathe. We have to have taxes to do the things we do together. Peter, I want to give me some color commentary on this graphic.
Oh, well, just going back to the car example, I think
Yeah.
it's interesting. I just saw a graph looking at the number of people ages, I think 18 to 24 in Germany, getting driver's license. Forget about the car. It's plummeted. And in case you think that what happens in Germany doesn't have anything to do with us, I can remember in 2002, my brother was living in Japan for some years, and I remember being on a train with him and seeing all these young people going like this on their phones. And I thought, what in the world are they doing? And now you look at our country and you see young people going like this. And so behaviors change, and then we have to, as a result, adjust our tax base. At some point in history, 1933, a momentous decision was made by the state to put a sales tax in place in the first place, and it you know, tax reform is a fact of life. You never get to some magic formula where you just stop and say, okay, we have the perfect tax system.
Yeah, but in general, you want the economies where everything's happening, that's commerce,
Right.
and you want your revenue base to track what's going on out there. And
Right.
this says it's not tracking.
That's correct. Yeah.
Mr. Darin, can you help this audience just think through the difference between a cyclical problem and a structural problem?
Yeah, so you think of cyclical.
I didn't tell him I was going to ask that, but it sounds like he's right ready to go.
Sure. So you think of cyclical things like the business cycle, right? We know we go into recessions, we come out of recessions, and each phase of the business cycle has different characteristics. And so you can largely anticipate some of those things. Now, structural things are things like instead of sales tax or retail sales, which can be cyclical, the way that we consume those goods, that is a structural shift, right? So those are longer term things that are occurring in spite of whatever's happening in the business cycle.
Yeah, okay, and then Phil, if you don't mind doubling down on that, can you apply that to what's happening with sales tax?
Yeah, and if I can just jump to one piece before that.
You're so welcome to do that.
One of my concerns looking at this, and one of the challenges that I think we face long term, if we don't address this, is you're likely to see pressure to increase tax rates, right? So as an economist, I very much argue for broad bases with low rates because it minimizes the damage that taxes cause to the economy. We're seeing that already, especially on local option sales tax rates. A little bit back now, relating it to some what Juliette was talking about before, we've seen very strong income tax growth in this state. There are a number of reasons for that. Part of it relates to some of the tax reform we did about a decade ago where we broadened the base, lowered the rate, and some of those structural changes we made to better align the income tax with the economy have had beneficial effects. We're seeing this strong income tax growth, and we have these limitations in the budget of what we can use funds for. Yeah. And so as we run up against constraints on the sales tax side, it means that we're going to see significant impacts in the near future. You know, we've been talking about this for a long time. Governor Walker, when she put out her tax reform report, Governor Huntsman, back in that time, we're talking about this issue, and we're to the time where it needs to be addressed.
Okay, great. So Phil just said something that I just want to sink in a little bit, and I won't quote you exactly, Phil, but he said something like, you know, I like broad base and lower rates, and I don't like high rates because it impacts the economy. So just to kind of make that real, Paul Edwards is sitting on the front row here. If Paul and I engage in a transaction, you know, if he has something to sell and I want to buy it, we only make that trade if both of us benefit. He only sells to me if he benefits, and I only buy if I benefit. If you put a tax on that transaction, you get in the way of market decisions. So that's what we think that's inefficient. And if you're taxing this transaction, but let's go over here to Abby, and we're not taxing this transaction, I might go there. So we just affected a market decision. That's inefficient. That's what we call inefficiency. So by higher rates, we get more in the way of economic decisions. And then one other thing, if we broaden the base, we become more fair because we treat Paul the same as Abby. So I think that's important to establish here. Okay, so can you tell we're kind of just going down this path? So the next point on this path is to actually talk about why this is happening. And Juliette, I'm going to go to you. I'm putting up another slide here.
Sure.
Here's a slide that Juliette has helped us think through. Explain this to the audience, if you will.
Yeah, sure. And so this is we've just, and this is par for the course in the economy just evolving and getting bigger and bigger and better and better. We've seen this fundamental shift from a goods-based economy to what I call a knowledge and service-based economy. And I think the governor alluded to this earlier, but you roll back 60 years ago and, you know, about half of all of our purchases were goods and about half of all of our purchases were services. Today, we spend a lot more of our household income on services, knowledge and services, than we do on goods. And it's just this transition in our economy. We're spending more on healthcare than we ever had before. We're spending more on our mortgages than we've ever had before. We're spending more on pension payments than we ever have before. And so that means that we're spending a smaller and smaller percentage of our incomes on goods. It's not that we're spending less money in total, it's just the relative proportions are shifting. Preferences are changing. We've mentioned the car example. You know, my car this morning was my phone. I just called Lyft this morning and got dropped off. We only have one car in my family, so we paid sales tax on one car. I think, you know, I actually, I got this from John. I had this great idea this summer that when we had to replace our lawnmower, we don't actually have to replace our lawnmower. We could hire a guy to come mow our lawn, and so we don't have to pay for that. And so I'm still using transportation just in a different way, and I'm still doing lawn work, but just in a different way. And so there's just this fundamental change in how we consume things.
Yeah, and if they would put that graphic back up, this is what we would call a structural change, because I'll go to you, Jonathan and Peter, to just comment, but it's not going to come, if it were cyclical, it would come back. Any comments you want to make there, either John or Peter?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that when I used the lawnmower example, I actually was not intending to induce you into buying a service and not paying sales tax. I was actually saying,
buy a lawnmower.
Yeah, go buy a lawnmower and pay sales tax. Yeah, absolutely. There was to that point, there was a billboard on I-80. So I live up Summit County. I drive down to work every day, and I'm going past this billboard every day. And it's a billboard for a landscape company. And I won't mention the name of the landscape company, but I'm sure you saw the billboard. And the slogan says, "Your lawn, our mower." And I said, that's it. That's our problem in a nutshell.
Your lawn.
It's your lawn, our mower. And you know, everybody, when I was a kid, everybody had a lawnmower, and everybody paid some kid on the block, usually under the table, to mow their lawn. And now we hire a landscape company, and you don't pay sales tax on the maintenance of the real property, and that's not going to change. Those preferences have changed over time.
The economy's growing, and the sales tax base is diminishing. Do you want to add anything there, Peter? We're
Yeah,
going to jump on
absolutely.
to
I think it's important to note that service portion, that growing portion, higher income citizens are spending more in that category, and the lower income citizens are spending a greater proportion, of course, in general, of their income on sales taxes. That's the regressivity. The regressivity is exacerbated when you rely more on the goods side and you don't have that service side kicking in.
Great. Okay, we have another trend we want to put up here. Let's go to the slide deck and look at this one. Juliette, I'm going to ask you, since we do the demographic work for the state, I'm going to ask you to explain this graphic and why it pertains to this issue. So we basically are saying we have this challenge. Here's the explanation for the challenge.
Sure, and so again, we're talking a lot about structural issues, right? Earlier on we talked about the business cycle and cyclical issues. Now we've moved on to discussing structural issues. And at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, my colleague, Dr. Pam Perlich, and her team produce long-term projections for Utah's population. So we don't project just the number of people, but we also project the age structure of those people. And given the dynamics, the current dynamics and the path that we're on, we're becoming, and this is true of the nation as well, we're becoming older and older and older. And so as you can see in this graph, we're looking at the percent of our population who will be over 65. I think it looks like in the graph we go out through 2030, and that will go on even further. But about 15% of our population within this time frame by 2030 will be over 65, and that will just that trend, that structural shift will continue into the future. And so there are a couple of things at play. The preferences of this population and what they spend money on are different. We talked about healthcare services. We're going to be consuming a lot more healthcare services in the future. We're the healthiest in the nation, and our older population is still relatively healthy compared to other places, but we still spend more on healthcare as we age. So you've got that side in terms of...
So maybe you used to spend on a boat, ATV, whatever, and now you spend that money on hip replacement.
Medication, hip replacement. And then on the flip side, I mean, I do say as I kind of hit each decade, 40's the new 30, 70's the new 50, but so that will change through time. We're healthier, but we'll still spend more. And then on the flip side, so you've got this, that we're driving revenue changes this way. But then on the flip side, the demands on state government or on kind of the public side of things will be changing through time. So the state of Utah, the actual state buys a lot of healthcare. And so this changing dynamic will also influence what the state is purchasing and the state's cost into the future.
Yeah. Darin, I just want you to remind us, because we're trying to see around a corner here, that aging population that we just saw, is that present everywhere, like in every state?
No, absolutely.
Okay, so
absolutely.
and so every state has a, not every state has a sales tax, but the vast majority do. So they're all feeling this.
Yeah, no, this is the thing across developed economies, and Pam and I have had conversations about this. Utah's tracking those trends. Now, we have a healthier birth rate than the rest of the nation, but this is problematic. And so when I look at that chart, what it tells me is now is the time to act, because these decisions become more difficult as time goes on.
Longer we wait.
Because we know that we're going to continue to age. We know that we're going to have additional expenses. So if anything, we should err on the side of overinvestment right now, and that sets us up for longer term success.
So that gets to my question. If we act now, can we avoid making even more difficult decisions during hard times? So we come to these events, and we've released the governor's economic report, and we always want the governor to feel our support and our affection, because he's our leader. So I'm just going to say something about something the governor did, because this is why we're talking about this, and it will lead to these next charts that get even deeper into this challenge, because we're going to go to the fiscal cliff, Bill, and things like that. But our governor proposed a budget where he did something really courageous, and it deals with this issue. And Phil, you're the right person to put the bells and whistles on. What did he do that's so courageous?
Basically proposed reforming our sales tax structure.
So we don't have to have it right now because we're doing well, but he's seeing it seeing around a corner. Okay.
Right, and in the context of that, doing that in a way that we lower the overall tax burden. His recommendation is $200 million of reduced taxes as part of a sales tax base expansion.
Okay, so you're in good economic times. The easy thing is just go put forward a budget that cuts taxes. But instead, our governor put forward a budget that says, yeah, you get some of this money back, but I'm also going to make needed reforms so that whoever comes after me, and for all of our children and grandchildren, education, healthcare, public safety, infrastructure, it's all better for us. That's pretty courageous. That's even worthy of an applause. I think, because I went to lunch, I don't know, after the governor's budget went public. I was with our former governor, Mike Leavitt, and he was commenting on this is hard to do, hard to do. And the reason it's hard to do is it creates, and this is tricky, but it creates winners and losers. Because if you're not currently being taxed, you're going to get it, you would get a tax if you do this, that. But they're really not losers because it's better for the whole pie. Okay, let's go to another slide. I don't even remember what's here. Okay, I want to take this sort of off the table a little bit, or I want to make sure the audience understands this issue. Who wants to tack this one? What I want to do is help them understand. Okay, you go, Jonathan.
Sure.
So we're talking about remote
It's-
sales and the internet and sales tax and the internet.
It's not the internet, okay? That's
Yeah.
the point of this slide. It's not the internet. We used to blame the remote sales and the fact that Quill Supreme Court decision said you don't get to collect sales tax on sales from outside your state. So we used to say, oh, that's the problem. Everybody's buying online, and therefore they're not paying sales tax. That's not the problem. I mean, it used to be a small part of the problem, but it's not the big problem. Although it does sort of tell us the problem or signals the problem. And the problem is, again, back to the changing preferences. It used to be when Quill passed, we had Sears Roebuck catalog, right? Or I don't know, maybe I'm aging myself. Anybody else out there remember the Sears catalog?
This
Right.
is an interesting month to be talking about
Yeah,
Sears.
well, exactly. So that's my point. That is my point. Exact point is that we had a Sears catalog, and you'd order from the Sears catalog. Now, and those transactions were not taxable. Now you order from Amazon Prime, and it's on your doorstep the next day, and you actually are paying sales tax on those transactions now. And so
Yeah.
this is even though our preferences have changed, our behaviors have changed. That is actually, you can see that in
Okay,
this
so
example, but you're not.
Put the graphic up again.
So even though we have all of these remote sales happening, we're taxing those now.
From 1% of
From
total
short
sales
to
to
9%.
9%. It's going higher. And
But we're not taxing services.
yeah, so these things have always been taxable through the use tax, but nobody paid it. Now it's
I paid it. I don't
now
A number of us paid.
Now it shows up on what you do, and those sales tax coming in. But why doesn't that solve our revenue problem? I need someone to.
Yeah,
go
and I'll
ahead,
tackle
Phil.
that one. I think there are a couple pieces to that.
Can I just? I want, you know. When you order on Amazon, you pay sales tax now, and the vast majority of things you pay. So why didn't that fill the gap?
Yeah, so with that, the legislature, in the discussions going back, 15, 20 years, had said, if we can handle this, it's for this fairness issue, it's not revenue issue, right? And when that was adopted, they enacted an offsetting cut with that. So the governor alluded to this manufacturing exemption that was enacted over this last year. That was an offset to the estimated revenue amounts for the remote sales issue
So the state gets
during
more
July.
money,
On the one
and
side,
it would help it, but we gave it back through an exemption
Right.
for the manufacturers
So
in the
it's-
state.
so it's an offset overall. So yes, more revenue coming in on the one side, but then less revenue on the other side.
I can tell Juliette wants to add something.
And that's a big piece of it. So it's getting at this fairness issue. Even if that policy hadn't been made though, and we did just continue, maybe we started, I don't know what the numbers, these guys will know what the actual numbers are, but it's a substantial amount of money that maybe we weren't collecting before and we're collecting now. Even if we didn't push that back in the form of some other policy, again, we're having a fundamental shift in our preferences. So yeah, maybe 10 years ago, I would have actually bought the lawnmower online. If I was going to go buy my lawnmower, I would have bought it online. But I'm not buying the lawnmower anymore. And so yeah, we're buying more and more online. It's a matter of convenience. We are taxing it now. Maybe we're giving some of that tax back in the form of a tax cut somewhere else. But again, it's just this fundamental change over time where it's nice where we've got this bump where we're collecting maybe what we should have been collecting all along, but that's not going to sustain us through time.
Great point. Okay, I just want to do a check with the audience. Everyone doing okay? We're still talking tax policy.
We love it. This is like our favorite topic.
Because we're going to go a level deeper now. We're going to go a level deeper. Let me see what the slide deck is, and I'll know where I want to go here. I'm going to go to this one. Okay. So this is a really nuanced thing to think about, but when you are in charge of a $19 billion budget, am I roughly in the right?
Yep.
Depending how you define it, you have to think about these things. And the fact is that we have these two funds, an income tax that's earmarked to education, and and a sales tax that pays for general government. And I'm going to ask you, Jonathan, and Phil, to explain why this is such a big deal, what we're seeing here.
Sure.
Tell them what they're looking at.
So this is the funding mix in higher education. All right, so you all know that in 1996, the Utah citizens passed a constitutional amendment that allowed the state government to spend income tax on not only public education, but also higher education. And you can see in 1997, we took a little chunk of income tax and we put it into higher education. And you can see the cycle there, right? You see 2000, that's 2001, that's the dot-com bust, boom and bust. And then you can see the housing run up, and then you see the Great Recession. And you see what happens there with the mix between sales tax in the general fund and income tax in the education fund going into higher ed. That was the intention behind Proposition 6 back in 1996, was to allow us to manage this volatility across the business cycle.
Yeah.
But
So you had an earmark that took away flexibility, and
You
you
add
you
flexibility.
added more flexibility by putting higher ed as part of the education fund, and they kind of go back and forth using it from the 6% to
And what you need to know is income tax is more volatile than sales tax, and so we meet out that volatility by putting sales tax in and out of higher education. Okay, so that's what it's supposed to do, is the cyclical thing. You talked about cycles versus trends, but what you can see is that when we came out of that dot-com bust, we got close to being back to 100% sales tax in higher ed. But when we came out of the Great Recession, I can say that word because I don't work for the governor. When we came out of the Great Recession, we didn't even get close to getting back to 100% of sales tax, and the trend continues downward. In fact, to the point where in 2011, you can see about 70% of higher education was funded from sales tax, and under the governor's budget proposal now, less than 3.
Less than 3.
Less than 3%.
So
right?
Phil, we call this, in the inside baseball, Capitol Hill budget world, Utah's fiscal cliff. Explain why it's a cliff.
Basically, once you don't have this flexibility that John was talking about in the budget, the general fund actually has to live off actual sales tax revenue, that you can't shift higher education anymore. What that means in real terms is that we have a structural change coming to the state budget situation in one way or another, right? Once you can't shift higher education anymore, you're either making very significant changes in some of the fundamental things that the state government does, the services that we provide. By the way, transportation is one of the big things that we're paying for out of sales tax. We're, gas tax, a lot of times we think that's paying for a lot of transportation, and it is. We're in the range of $500 million there. But we have about $650 million, if I remember right, coming from sales tax. So that means significant impacts on investments in transportation infrastructure, investments in other types of infrastructure, public safety, air quality, Medicaid. These types of issues are what are going to be impacted. So you look at the options there, I don't see any of them as being fun or exciting or, hey, I just am happy to be doing this options. We are seeing strong growth in income tax, so one thing that is a potential thing that certainly not what I would recommend, but you could undo the earmarking, constitutional earmarking of income tax for education. Again, not my recommendation, but that's one possibility because we are seeing really good growth in the income tax. You can deal with the sales tax and expand the base to better align it with the economy, or you fundamentally start disinvesting in transportation and these other items that I've been talking about.
Yeah.
Can I put a little finer point on it than
Please.
that? If we don't fix this, we're not going to be able to pay for law enforcement and Medicaid and the things that are outside transportation and education because those two revenue sources are constitutionally earmarked.
Great. So I mentioned right at the beginning that we're in an exercise of making hay while the sun shines, seeing around corners. And I gave a couple examples. I gave the living legacy of the Olympics. You know, our state, in a really difficult way, took sales tax and invested in speed skating ovals and ski jumps and luge runs before we even had the games. Like, we took a risk, but it created this living legacy that's so incredible for our state. I mentioned transit. It was pretty hard during the last boom. I'm going to say before the downturn, like say in about 2006, to raise our sales tax to pay for this transit network and other roads, but we did it. So in surplus times, we raised taxes to invest because we had a way to get it. Chris remembers this well, a way to make it happen. It's really hard. Phil mentioned the quadruple A bond rating. I've never heard that before, Phil, pretty clever. You know, it's hard to not spend on all these great needs, but we use this fiscal discipline. So we've got this situation now where we know there's a problem. Anybody looking at this would know there's a problem, and we can act. Okay, I want to do these, and I'm going to ask Peter, let's, this is the one you want to talk about.
Sure.
Is that right? Am I getting that right?
I'll be happy to talk about
okay,
that. Okay,
we're going deeper to I'm just giving you a sense of what people inside, you know, the fiscal offices on Capitol Hill have to deal with.
Well, you talked about winners and losers, and we are creating more winners through exemptions as we go along. What's interesting about the graphic that's up there now is you see a trend towards more and more exemptions, kind of a flurry beginning more in recent times. Now, with every exemption, we ought to be asking ourselves, what is the public benefit to society that we can clearly articulate to the average citizen? We're doing this for you.
Yeah.
So that question ought to be we ought to be asked and answered every time a new exemption comes along. In a lot of cases, our exemptions are we're trying to be more efficient as an economy, right? Or hands up, who wants to tax items sold at school fundraisers?
If we can keep the rate really low.
But the issue would be that one person's tax break is another person's tax burden.
Right, and another important point about this is the wider you open that door, every time another one goes through the door, there are a few more that kind of look similar.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the slide deck, and Phil, I'd love you to comment on this one.
Yeah, so this is the portion primarily for transportation, right, of earmarked sales taxes. That this is something, I would be one of the first to argue that the state underinvested in transportation for a long time. And why was that? Well, you know, we put general fund sometimes, but primarily it was, transportation used to be funded with a gas tax, right? And gas tax is really hard to increase. Oh, and by the way, the gas tax isn't even coming close to pacing with the economy, right? So we have this economic growth and the need for additional transportation infrastructure on the one side, and we have a revenue source that's not even anywhere near what those transportation needs are. So then what do? Well, you look for other revenue sources. Earmarks, I think, aren't the best approach necessarily as a way to do it, although I think the investment behind it, part of it is important. Part of the challenge with earmarks is it takes place kind of before the debate starts happening. And so it's not that the money ends up at that place at the end of the day, it's that there's not the rigorous debate and the rigorous evaluation every year through the normal budget process, that it kind of, not that it's never discussed, but you know, it's kind of gets a little bit preferential treatment in the budget process.
I always think of it as an IV, like this intravenous, it just goes to you, you know? Okay, we've got just under 10 minutes to finish this up, and I want to take just a second. Can we show that chart one more time? And I just want to give you an example how this goes governor to governor to governor. But I served in Governor Levitt's office as his spokesperson in 2003 when he became the EPA administrator and went and joined the Bush administration. And I kept getting questions as his spokesperson. Does the governor have any regrets? Is there anything that the governor, you know, wishes he could have accomplished that he didn't? And, you know, and the political thing to say is, you know, no, you know, he's really proud of his service, blah, blah, blah. But I knew that that wasn't authentic. I knew that there were some things that would be helpful to talk about. So anyway, I had a conversation with the governor, and we decided he really wished he could have gotten BLM wilderness bill done, and it didn't happen. Still hasn't in a major way. But his other issue was that he had let go into law without his signature an earmark for water in this state. And I realize that might be controversial to some people that, you know, that's what his regret was. But look at what it was in 2003, and that was his regret.
Yeah.
So I think that just shines a light on how, when you take away this kind of budget flexibility, how it makes it harder to fund the highest priority things in any given year.
Can I
Looks
disagree
like,
with
please.
you just for a second?
Oh, he's going to disagree with me. This is
Just
great.
for a second, because...
Yeah. But you're not disagreeing with me.
No,
You're taking on the big guy.
Governor Levitt or Governor Herbert?
Back in the time.
That's my job.
It is.
So, but this, if that were the case, if flexibility were taken away by earmarks, that line would be straight. That trend would be straight. And look what happens in the recessions.
Yeah.
We have not forgotten about that $643 million in the budget.
Yeah.
Right.
It gave you
And we do
money
have
you could go
flexibility
take.
to change, exactly. But
He's basically saying we earmark it, but we can still go get it.
it doesn't, we still have a need.
Yeah.
Whether you earmark
Yeah.
it or not, don't earmark it, you could not invest in transportation, I suppose,
Yeah.
but then you'd pay for it in congestion.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got one more question for our panelists, but I want each of you to answer it. Darin, we're going to start with you and work this way. We'll give the legislative fiscal analyst the last word. But we have a lot of business leaders in the audience. We have a lot of tax policy experts in the audience. We have elected officials. We have our governor. This is your chance to give them advice about this structural problem facing our state. What advice do you give state decision makers?
Move now, because we know where this is going, and it's only going to become more difficult. And these are things that affect all of the issues we've talked about are issues of competitiveness.
Yeah.
Right? And so whether it's our own quality of life, our ability to attract talent into the state, all of those things, this is our livelihood going forward. So move quickly while we're still young. We know that the costs are going to increase in the future. We know where the train's going. The time to go is now.
Okay, and that's a private sector opinion, which
Yeah,
I
that's
value
right.
here. Okay, Phil?
Two things for me. One, focus on what you can control. You know, there are some things out in the world that are beyond our control, but we can focus on what we do here, how we prepare. And so the second piece of that, one of the things that we can control is our tax structure, right? So my recommendation is to modernize the tax structure by broadening the base and making that rate as low as we politically can do. Get as far as we can with that.
That's great. Juliette?
I'm just going to echo the governor, make hay while the sun shines. Now we really have kind of the perfect opportunity where the economy is really good right now. We have a lot of room to be conscientious about the decisions we're making in terms of tax modernization.
It's a luxury.
Yeah, it really is. And I
Yeah.
worry that as we kind of move through the next business cycle and we get to a different place in our economy, those options might be more limited. And as those options are limited, there's a greater risk of harming our economic competitiveness. So just make hay while the sun shines.
Peter?
Getting back to Natalie's winners and losers theme one last time, it's important to remember the more losers we create, the easier it'll be on all losers. So if we bring down the rate by expanding that base, we ought to shoot for, if we're going to do it, and you want to soften the impact, you want to get that base as broad as possible.
Because you want the rate as low
Yeah,
as possible.
right.
Yeah, very good. And Jonathan, I'll give you the last word, although I'm going to share one last sentiment.
Okay, so to quote the great Jimmy Buffett, it's my job to be worried half to death, and that's the thing people respect in me. So I would say if you're going to do something like this, do it from a sustainable revenue assumption. Don't do it at $1.3 billion, assuming you're going to have $1.3 billion forever. Assume that goes away. Some of that goes away, not because of the economy, but because of changing behaviors. And then the problem is more complex than just sales tax. If you're really going to fix the fiscal cliff, you need to look at sales tax bases and income tax rates.
That's great. Let's give our panelists a big, big hand. You're all great. Okay. You all were great to endure some tax policy this early in the morning. We're going to conclude this panel, but I'll just share one sentiment that you'll find kind of interesting. We have a lot of conversations in the first session about social cohesion and social capital and our secret sauce. I got a text from a friend in the audience who said that Utah's secret sauce is fry sauce. Enjoy.